Cold rain slithered down the cracked asphalt, pooling in uneven patches along the deserted alley. Ryan Walker pressed his back against a wall of grime-covered bricks, his breaths ragged and uneven. His face was a mess of blood and dirt, a deep gash above his brow leaking crimson down his cheek. His ribs screamed with every inhale, and he knew at least 2 of them were cracked, maybe worse. His right hand trembled as he pressed against his side, feeling the sticky warmth of his own blood seeping through his jacket. Every muscle in his body protested as he tried to push himself up, only to collapse back against the wall. His fingers left red streaks on the brick. This wasn't supposed to happen. It was supposed to be a simple visit. How the hell had he ended up here? The distant growl of motorcycle engines cut through the night, low and menacing. They were still looking for him. The storm-muted city seemed to hold its breath as the echoes bounced between the buildings. Ryan clenched his jaw, forcing himself to move, but his body had other plans. His legs buckled, his vision blurred, and for a split second, he thought about just letting go, letting the darkness take him. But that thought vanished the moment he heard footsteps, heavy, measured, a predator approaching its wounded prey. Under the flickering street lamp at the end of the alley, a shadow took shape. Tall, broad shoulders, clad in a leather vest emblazoned, with the unmistakable insignia of the Iron Fangs, a snarling skull with jagged fangs. The man stopped, gripping a wooden baseball bat wrapped in barbed wire. Ryan knew that face, knew that grin, one of the bastards who had put him in this condition. "This is for what you did, you son of a bitch," the biker growled, his knuckles whitening around the bat's handle. Ryan tried to move, but the pain shot through his side like a lightning strike, forcing him to grit his teeth to stifle a groan. He wasn't going to beg, wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. The biker stepped closer, raising the bat high over his shoulder, and then darkness, not death, not yet. Just a sudden, violent cut to black. Weeks earlier, the bus pulled into the station with a mechanical groan, its rusted frame shuddering to a stop. Ryan stepped out onto the cracked pavement, a single duffel bag slung over his shoulder. The scent of damp concrete and oil filled his lungs as he took his first breath of Detroit in over a decade. He had seen war zones with more life than this. Streetlights buzzed faintly, casting weak, sickly glows over empty storefronts and boarded-up businesses. Garbage lined the gutters, and faded graffiti screamed silent warnings on crumbling brick walls. Home, or what was left of it. He adjusted his bag and started walking. His boots felt heavier with each step, the weight of his past pressing down on him as he passed familiar streets, turned unfamiliar ruins. The buildings hadn't just decayed, they had been gutted. This wasn't just neglect. This was systematic. The diner still stood. Somehow Ryan stopped in front of Dalton's, the once bustling restaurant now barely clinging to life. The old neon sign flickered weakly, and only one of the front windows wasn't boarded up. He pushed open the door, the small bell above jingling with a sad, hollow chime. The smell of grease and burnt coffee hit him first, followed by the sight of a single occupied booth in the back. The place was nearly empty, save for the man behind the counter. Chris Dalton. Chris looked up mid-wipe of a cracked coffee cup and froze. A long second stretched between them before he finally exhaled. "Well, I'll be damned," Chris muttered, setting the cup down. "Ryan Walker, back from the dead." Ryan shrugged, stepping toward the counter. Not quite. Chris studied him, his expression unreadable. The years had aged him in ways that went beyond gray hairs and wrinkles. There was a weight in his eyes, something tired and guarded. "You look like shit," Chris finally said, reaching for a second cup. "Coffee?" Ryan nodded, lowering himself onto a stool with a quiet grunt. "Yeah, black." Chris poured the coffee in. Silence, then slid the cup over. Ryan took it but didn't drink. Instead, he glanced around the empty diner. "I remember this place being packed at this hour." Chris let out a dry chuckle. "That was before. City's different now." Ryan looked at him, waiting. Chris sighed, leaning against the counter. "Iron Fangs. They run this side of town now. Businesses either pay them or close up shop. Most people don't fight back." He gestured to the empty seats around them. "That's why this place looks like a ghost town, and why you shouldn't be here." Ryan clenched his jaw, gripping the coffee cup a little tighter. "And you?" Chris hesitated, then shrugged. "I pay what I have to. Keep my head down. No choice, really." Ryan felt something twist in his chest. Chris Dalton wasn't a coward. He had been the toughest guy on the block when they were kids, and now he was just another man trying to survive. Ryan finally took a sip of the coffee, letting the bitterness settle on his tongue. The city was rotting from the inside out, and the people he cared about were being crushed under its weight. Chris watched him for a moment before shaking his head. "Look, man, whatever reason brought you back, do yourself a favor. Get back on that bus. Detroit ain't your fight anymore." Ryan set the cup down, his mind already racing. That's where Chris was wrong. It was always his fight. Ryan walked through the streets of his old neighborhood, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn jacket, eyes scanning the ruins of a city he barely recognized. Detroit had always been rough, but this was different. It wasn't just abandoned buildings and cracked sidewalks. It was a city hollowed out, stripped of whatever life had once fought to survive here. The roads were littered with trash, old newspapers fluttering like dying birds in the cold wind. Storefronts that had once been bustling with customers were now boarded up, graffiti scrawled across their surfaces, some of it desperate pleas for help, others warnings. Shadows moved in alleyways, figures lurking just outside the reach of flickering streetlights, watching. Ryan had been in war zones that felt safer than this. He turned a corner and found himself in front of what used to be Carter's Auto, the small repair shop where he and Michael had spent countless hours as teenagers. The sign was still there, but the windows were shattered, the doors hanging loose from their rusted hinges. The sight of it made something tighten in his chest. Another reminder of everything that had been lost. He exhaled slowly and kept walking. A few blocks later, he stopped in front of a small convenience store. Hassan's Place. The faded sign still hung above the entrance, though it looked like it had taken a beating. Ryan had known Hassan for years, a hard-working immigrant who had always treated the neighborhood kids like his own. If anyone could tell him how bad things had gotten, it would be him. He pushed open the door, and the bell above jingled weakly. Inside, the store was dimly lit, shelves half empty. A security camera in the corner was shattered, its wires dangling uselessly. Behind the counter, Hassan looked up, his tired eyes widening slightly when he saw Ryan. "Walker." Hassan's voice was rough, like he hadn't had a good night's sleep in years. Ryan gave a small nod. "Been a while." Hassan set down the pack of cigarettes he'd been stocking and leaned on the counter. "Didn't think I'd ever see you back here. Thought you got out for good." "Guess I'm just bad at staying gone," Ryan said, glancing around the store. "Looks like things have changed." Hassan let out a dry chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "Changed? No, my friend. This place has been gutted. The city's bleeding out, and the bastards running the show are just picking the bones clean." Ryan leaned against the counter. Chris mentioned the Iron Fangs. Hassan's expression darkened. He glanced toward the door, as if making sure no one was listening. "They're not just some gang, Ryan. They own this place now. You either pay, or them, or you disappear." Ryan studied the lines on Hassan's face, the way his hands trembled slightly as he rearranged a row of energy drinks. The man had always been tough, always stood his ground, but now he looked like someone who had been beaten down too many times. "You paying them?" Ryan asked. Hassan's jaw clenched. "I don't have a choice." Not if I want to keep my family safe. He hesitated, then leaned in closer. But even that might not be enough anymore. They're getting greedier, demanding more. Sooner or later, they'll take everything. Ryan felt his pulse slow, that old familiar burn building in his chest. He'd seen this before. Different place, different players, but the same damn game. He knew how it ended, and he knew he couldn't just stand by and watch it happen. The door suddenly swung open, and two men stepped inside. Ryan recognized the type immediately. They weren't just thugs. They carried themselves like men who knew they had nothing to fear. The taller of the two had tattoos snaking up his arms, his vest proudly displaying the Iron Fang's emblem. His partner, a stockier man with a scar running from his ear to his chin, cracked his knuckles as he stepped toward the counter. Hassan stiffened, his hands gripping the edge of the register. "Right on time," the tattooed man said, his voice smooth but laced with quiet menace. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and tossed it onto the counter. "New rates." Hassan picked up the paper, his face draining of color. This is double what I was paying last month," the man shrugged. "Yeah, well, times are tough, you understand." Ryan's fingers curled into fists. He'd seen this play out before. The fear, the helplessness. He knew exactly how this scene would end if no one stopped it. Hassan's voice was tight. "I can't afford this." The tattooed man sighed, then reached over the counter, grabbing Hassan by the collar and yanking him forward. "That's not our problem, old man." Ryan moved before he even thought about it. His hand clamped around the thug's wrist, squeezing hard enough to make the man grunt in pain. "Let him go," Ryan said, his voice low and controlled. The room went silent. The stocky man stepped forward, his hand going to the knife at his belt. The tattooed man smirked, though his eyes flickered with something uncertain. "And who the hell are you supposed to be?" Ryan didn't answer. He just twisted the man's wrist, forcing him to release Hassan before shoving him back. The thug stumbled but caught himself, his smirk turning into a sneer. "You just made a big mistake, asshole." Ryan barely saw the punch coming, but his instincts kicked in. He sidestepped, grabbed the man's arm, and drove his knee into his ribs. The thug gasped, staggering back. The stocky man lunged at him, but Ryan was already moving. He caught the man's wrist, twisted, and drove his elbow into his jaw, sending him crashing into the nearest shelf. The fight lasted less than 10 seconds. The tattooed man scrambled to his feet, wiping blood from his mouth. His eyes locked onto Ryan with something between rage and recognition. He didn't say anything, just pulled out his phone, tapped something, and then turned toward the door. "This ain't over," he spat, before shoving past the broken shelves and disappearing into the night. Ryan exhaled slowly, shaking the tension from his hands. He turned to Hassan, who was staring at him like he'd just sprouted wings. "You don't know what you just did," Hassan muttered. Ryan picked up the crumpled piece of paper the thug had left behind and glanced at the numbers. "Yeah," he said, quietly. "I do." Outside, a man in a leather vest stood beneath a street lamp watching. He had seen everything, and he was smiling. Then he pulled out his phone and made a call. Ryan Walker had just made enemies. Ryan didn't sleep that night. He sat in the darkness of his rented room, the dull glow of a street lamp filtering through the thin curtains, casting long shadows across the walls. His body still ached from the fight, but the pain was secondary. What mattered was the choice he had made. He could have walked away at any point, could have let Hassan handle his own problems. But that wasn't who he was. That had never been who he was. And now the Iron Fangs knew his name. He wasn't naive enough to think they'd let this slide. They were coming. It was just a question of when. He stared at his duffel bag in the corner of the room. Inside, his past was neatly folded and packed away, old military fatigues, a few personal belongings, and the pistol he hadn't touched since he left the service. He could leave. Get on the next bus out of Detroit and never look back. But even as he considered it, he knew the truth. He wasn't going anywhere. Not until this was finished. Morning came with a pale, washed-out sky and the distant rumble of traffic. Ryan stepped outside, stretching out the stiffness in his muscles as he walked toward Dalton's diner. The streets were quieter than usual. People avoided eye contact, heads down, moving quickly. They had heard what happened. Word traveled fast in neighborhoods like this. He pushed open the door to the diner, the familiar chime of the bell greeting him. Chris was behind the counter, pouring coffee into a chipped mug. He didn't look up as Ryan approached. "What the hell did you do?" Ryan slid onto a stool, had a conversation. Chris set the coffee pot down with more force than necessary. "Bullshit! You put 2 of them in the hospital. You think that just goes away?" Ryan took the cup, studying the steam rising from it. They were shaking down Hassan. Someone had to do something. Chris exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "Yeah, and now you just painted a target on your back. You have no idea what these guys are capable of, Ryan. They're not just some street gang. They've got connections, cops, politicians, the kind of people who make problems disappear." Ryan took a slow sip of coffee, letting the bitterness settle on his tongue. "Then maybe it's time someone made them disappear." Chris stared at him, then let out a dry laugh. "You're serious?" Ryan met his gaze. "Dead serious." Chris shook his head, muttering something under his breath before leaning on the counter. "Look, man, I get it, I do. But you're not in the army anymore. This isn't a war zone. You don't have backup, you don't have orders. You're just one guy against a gang that owns half the city." Ryan set his cup down. "Then I'll just have to take them apart piece by piece." Chris sighed, rubbing his face. "Jesus, Walker, you really haven't changed, have you?" Before Ryan could answer, the door swung open. A man walked in, moving with the slow, deliberate confidence of someone who didn't need to prove himself. Tall, lean, wearing a leather vest with the Iron Fang's emblem stitched into the back. His dark eyes scanned the diner, locking onto Ryan. With a hint of amusement, he walked over and slid into the stool beside him. Chris tensed. "Coffee?" The man smiled. "Sure, black." Ryan didn't move, didn't speak. He just studied the man. He wasn't like the thugs from last night. This one carried himself differently. He was the kind of guy who didn't need to raise his voice to make people listen. Chris poured the coffee, his hands steady despite the tension thickening the air. The Iron Fang took a slow sip before setting the cup down. "You really fucked up last night, Walker," Ryan finally spoke. "You know my name," the man smirked. "Of course I do. When someone puts 2 of my guys in the hospital, I make it my business to know who they are." Ryan met his gaze. "Then you also know why I did it," the man chuckled, shaking his head. "See, that's where you got it twisted. It doesn't matter why. What matters is that you did. And that means we have a problem." He leaned in slightly, voice dropping lower. "But I like you, Walker. I respect a guy who doesn't back down. So I'm going to give you a chance. Walk away, get on a bus, disappear. Do that, and we forget this happened." Ryan took a sip of his coffee. "And if I don't?" The man sighed dramatically, shaking his head. "Then I stop being nice." Ryan set his cup down and turned to face him fully. "You know, I've heard threats from men a lot scarier than you, and they all made the same mistake." The Iron Fang raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah, what's that?" Ryan didn't blink. "They assumed I was the one who should be scared." The man studied him for a long moment, then smiled. "All right, Walker, have it your way." He stood, adjusting his vest. "I was hoping you'd be smarter, but hey, your funeral." He threw a few bills onto the counter, nodding at Chris. "Thanks for the coffee." Ryan watched him leave, the door swinging shut behind him. Chris let out a breath. That was Jesse Flynn, second in command of the Iron Fangs. "That was your warning." Ryan downed the last of his coffee, pushing the cup aside. Then I guess I just declared war." Chris shook his head. "You're gonna get yourself killed, man." Ryan stood, rolling his shoulders. "Then I better make it count." As he stepped outside, he felt the eyes on him, watching, waiting. The game had officially begun, and he wasn't planning on losing. Ryan didn't make it halfway back to his place before he knew he was being followed. The feeling crawled up his spine, a quiet, instinctual alarm that had kept him alive in places far worse than this city. He didn't turn around, didn't break. His stride, he just listened, the faint scuff of boots on pavement, the way the footsteps adjusted when he did. They weren't trying to be obvious. They were waiting, calculating. He took a sharp left into an alleyway, his boots splashing through a shallow puddle. A chain-link fence loomed at the end, rusted and covered in old, torn flyers. The buildings on either side were tall and close, casting deep shadows even in daylight. Perfect for an ambush. He stopped walking, exhaled slowly, and rolled his shoulders. Then he turned. 3 men stepped into the alley behind him, blocking the exit. Leather vests, iron fangs, insignias gleaming. Under the dim light, the one in the middle was stocky, bald, a jagged scar running from his cheek down to his neck. He cracked his knuckles, a slow grin spreading across his face. "Flynn said you were too dumb to take the offer," the scarred man said. "Guess he was." "Right." Ryan glanced between them, his pulse steady, his stance loose. "You always need 3 guys for one?" The man on the left, younger, eager, took a step forward. "Think you're tough, old man?" Ryan smirked. "Old enough to know you're about to make a mistake." The kid lunged first, telegraphing his move a mile away. Ryan sidestepped, grabbed the back of his head, and drove it into the brick wall. The impact was sickening, and the kid crumpled instantly. No time to think. The scarred man was already swinging a crowbar. Ryan ducked, felt the rush of air as metal passed inches from his face, then drove an elbow into the man's ribs. A grunt of pain, but he didn't go down. Tough bastard. The third man tried to grab him from behind. Ryan twisted, breaking the grip, then slammed his knee into the guy's stomach. He doubled over, gasping. The scarred man recovered, swinging. The crowbar again. Ryan caught his wrist, twisted hard, and the weapon clattered to the ground. He followed up with a brutal punch to the jaw, then another. The man staggered, eyes unfocused. Ryan grabbed the front of his vest and slammed him against the wall. "You tell Flynn," Ryan said, his voice low, controlled, "that I don't scare easy." The man spat blood onto the pavement, his breathing ragged. "You're a dead man." Ryan let him go, watching as he slid down the wall, barely conscious. He stepped over the unconscious kid and walked past the one still curled up, wheezing. The message had been sent, but this was just the beginning. He made it back to his place without another incident. The moment he stepped inside, he knew something was wrong. The door wasn't busted in, no forced entry, but the air felt off. He reached for the pistol in his duffel bag as he moved through the small apartment, his every sense on high alert. His bedroom had been torn apart, the mattress slashed open, drawers emptied, clothes scattered. A message had been carved into the drywall above his bed with something sharp. "Walk away." Ryan clenched his jaw, his grip tightening on the pistol. This wasn't a robbery. They hadn't taken anything. This was a warning, a promise. He sat on the edge of the ruined bed, exhaling slowly. He wasn't surprised. He had made his choice the moment he stepped between Hassan and those thugs. And now he was in it. Fully. There was only one person he could trust right now. Dalton's. Dinah was quieter than usual when he arrived. Chris was behind the counter, wiping down a glass. He looked up, took one look at Ryan, and let out a long sigh. "Jesus, already?" Ryan slid into a stool. "They trashed my place." Chris tossed the rag aside. "Yeah, no shit. You put 3 of their guys in the hospital today." Ryan leaned forward, voice calm. "I need to know everything. How deep are they in? Who's backing them?" Chris hesitated, glancing toward the only other occupied booth, a lone man sipping his coffee, paying them no mind. He lowered his voice. "Look, Ryan, this isn't just a gang. They've got money, real money. They don't just run the streets, they own people. Cops, judges, even a couple of councilmen. The city doesn't stop them because the city works. For them, Ryan absorbed the information, his mind already working through possibilities. Who's at the top? Chris frowned. Flynn is high up, but he's not the boss. The guy pulling the strings is Raymond Blackwood. Ryan's fingers tapped against the counter. Blackwood, the real estate guy? Chris nodded. Yeah, rich bastard. Buys up property for dirt cheap, turns it into high-end developments. And guess how he gets the property? Ryan didn't have to guess. The Iron Fangs drive people out. Chris's expression was grim. Exactly. They scare people into selling for nothing. Blackwood makes a killing. Ryan sat back, his jaw tightening. This wasn't just a gang problem. This was systemic. A citywide operation designed to bleed people dry. And now he was in their way. Chris leaned forward. Listen, man, I respect what you're trying to do. I do. But this isn't just some bar fight. These people don't play fair. They'll come at you from every angle. Ryan nodded slowly. I know. Chris studied him, then shook his head. Damn it, Walker. Ryan smirked. Good to see you still care. Chris sighed, rubbing his face. I don't know why I bother. Ryan finished his coffee and stood. Because deep down, you know this city's worth fighting for. Chris didn't respond. He didn't have to. Ryan stepped outside into the cold night air, pulling his jacket tighter. The street was quiet, but he could feel the eyes on him, watching, waiting. He wasn't just fighting a gang anymore. He was taking on an empire. Ryan knew they wouldn't wait long to make their next move. The Iron Fangs had given him their warning, and he had answered with broken bones. Now it was their turn to respond. The question wasn't if, they were coming. The only thing left to determine was when and how. That answer arrived faster than expected. He had barely walked 5 blocks from the diner when he heard the low, menacing rumble of motorcycle engines. Not one, not 2, more. The sound crawled through the empty streets like a predator circling its prey. Ryan didn't break his stride, didn't turn to look. He kept walking, hands loose at his sides, breath steady. Running was pointless. They wanted him, and they had enough men to make sure he wasn't getting away clean. The first bike roared past him, cutting close, forcing him to take a step back. The second followed, slower, the rider turning his head just enough to make sure. Ryan saw the smirk beneath his helmet. Then came the third, then the fourth. By the time the 5th and 6th bikes passed, they had formed a loose circle, engines revving, exhaust fumes thick in the air. Ryan finally stopped walking, his fists curled, but he didn't reach for his gun. Not yet. He could see the trap for what it was. They wanted to drag this out, let fear do most of the work before the violence started. One of the bikes rolled to a stop directly in front of him. The rider swung a leg over, boots hitting the pavement with deliberate slowness. Ryan recognized him immediately. Ethan Carter. Ryan's chest tightened. For a second, the world blurred, not with fear, not with adrenaline, but with memory. A different time, a different place. Sand and blood, gunfire echoing through ruined buildings. Ethan had been younger then, reckless, but still good at heart. A kid following his older brother's footsteps. And now here he was, standing in the middle of a dead city, wearing the colors of the same gang Ryan had been fighting since he stepped off that bus. Ethan's smirk was lazy, confident, but there was something else in his eyes, something unreadable. Ryan Walker, he said, shaking his head, didn't think I'd see you again. Ryan kept his voice even. Ethan. The other riders dismounted, forming a half circle around them. Some cracked their knuckles, others rested hands on the weapons at their belts, knives, chains, a couple of pistols. The air was thick with tension, but no one moved yet, not until Ethan gave the order. Ethan took a slow step closer, studying. Ryan like a scientist examining something under a microscope. You always had a way of finding trouble. I remember Michael used to say that about you. Ryan's jaw tightened at the mention of Michael's name. He didn't flinch, didn't let the emotion show. And I remember Michael being the only thing, keeping you from getting yourself killed. Ethan's smirk faltered for half a second. Then it was back, sharper this time. Yeah, well, he's not here anymore, is he? Ryan exhaled slowly. No, he's not. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy with history neither of them wanted to dig up. Finally, Ethan tilted his head. You really shouldn't have messed with my guys, Walker. You had a chance to walk away, twice, but you just couldn't. Help yourself. Ryan didn't blink. I don't like bullies. Ethan chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. Still playing the hero, huh? Let me ask you something, Ryan. Did it work out for you last time? Ryan didn't answer. He didn't need to. Ethan already knew the truth. Ethan sighed, rolling his shoulders. See, here's the problem. You're making things complicated. You come back, start throwing punches, acting like this place can still be saved, but you don't get it. Detroit's already dead. The Iron Fangs didn't kill it. We just took what was left. Ryan's voice was low. Michael would have kicked your ass if he saw what you've become. Something flickered in Ethan's eyes. For the briefest moment, Ryan saw the kid he used to be. The kid who had idolized his brother, who had wanted to be more. But then the moment passed and Ethan's expression hardened. You don't get to talk about Michael, Ethan said, his voice sharp, a knife in the dark. Not after what happened. Not after what you did. Ryan's stomach twisted, but he kept his face unreadable. You think I wanted him to die? Ethan's jaw clenched. His hands curled into fists at his sides. I think you let it happen. The words hit harder than any punch ever could. Ryan had spent years carrying that weight, and hearing Ethan say it out loud only made it heavier. He could have tried to explain, could have told him the truth about that day, about the choices that had been made in the heat of battle, but it wouldn't have mattered. Ethan had already made up his mind. Ethan exhaled sharply, stepping back. Enough talking. He gestured to his men. Kill him. The first punch came from the left. Ryan barely ducked in time, countering with an elbow to the attacker's ribs. A second man swung a chain, but Ryan twisted, grabbing his arm and slamming him into the pavement. Another came at him with a knife. Ryan caught his wrist, drove a knee into his stomach, and wrenched the blade away before slamming his fist into the man's jaw. But there were too many of them. A fist caught Ryan in the ribs. Pain exploded through his side. Someone kicked his knee and he buckled. Another punch to his temple sent his vision spinning. He fought back, but the numbers were overwhelming. A boot slammed into his back, driving him to the ground. More kicks followed, sharp, brutal. He tasted blood. Through the haze, he saw Ethan watching, not moving, not helping, just watching. Ryan tried to push himself up, but a heavy boot pressed down on his chest, pinning him in place. The world swam, shadows dancing at the edges of his vision. Ethan crouched beside him, voice quiet. You should have stayed gone, Ryan. The last thing Ryan saw was Ethan standing up, giving a small nod to his men. Then a fist crashed into his skull and everything went black. Pain dragged Ryan back to consciousness. It was a slow, brutal process. First the dull throb in his ribs, then the sharp sting in his temple where someone had split the skin open. His entire body felt like it had been through a meat grinder. He tasted blood, coppery and thick on his tongue. His head pounded in sync with his heartbeat, each pulse sending fresh waves of agony through his skull. The world swam as he tried to open his eyes, but the light was too harsh, stabbing into his retinas like knives. He blinked rapidly, forcing himself to focus. A room. Small. Bare concrete walls. A single exposed bulb buzzing faintly above. A metal chair beneath him, his wrists zip-tied behind his back, His legs were bound at the ankles, the restraints cutting into his skin. He inhaled deeply, testing his ribs. At least 2 were cracked, maybe broken. Breathing hurt like hell. Footsteps echoed against the concrete, slow, deliberate. A door creaked open, and Ryan forced himself to look up despite the pain. Jesse Flynn stepped into the room, dressed in the same leather vest he always wore, the Iron Fang's insignia stitched over his chest like a badge of honor. He had that same smug grin, the one that said he thought he had already won. "Shit, Walker," Flynn said, shaking his head. "You look like hell." Ryan swallowed, his throat raw. "Yeah? You should see the other guys." Flynn chuckled, walking a slow circle around the chair. "Oh, I did. Couple of them needed stitches. One might have a broken nose. But see, the difference is they walked away. You're tied to a chair in the middle of nowhere, bleeding all over my damn floor." He crouched down in front of Ryan, eyes narrowing. "Tell me, hero, was it worth it?" Ryan didn't answer. He just stared, unblinking. Flynn sighed, rubbing his jaw. "You know, I get it, I do. You're the big, tough soldier. You think you can fix this place, but you're fighting a war that's already lost." He leaned in closer, voice dropping. "Detroit belongs to us. No one's coming to save it, and sure as hell no one's coming to save you." Ryan smirked, despite the pain. "You talk too much." Flynn's expression darkened. The first punch came fast, a brutal right hook that snapped Ryan's head to the side. His vision blurred for a second, stars dancing at the edges. Blood dripped from his split lip, warm and metallic. Flynn stood up, exhaling sharply. "See, normally we'd just put a bullet in your head and be done with it. But Ethan..." He let the name hang in the air, watching for a reaction. "Ethan said to wait." Ryan's jaw tightened. Flynn nodded, satisfied. "Yeah, that got your attention." He pulled a pack of cigarettes from his pocket, tapping one against the side before lighting it. The scent of burning tobacco filled the room. "I gotta admit, I don't get it. Ethan's been one of us for years now, loyal, cold. But you show up and suddenly he's all conflicted." Flynn exhaled a slow stream of smoke. "So I'm gonna let him decide what to do with you. Me? I hope he lets me carve you up piece by piece." Ryan sat perfectly still, his mind working fast despite the haze of pain. Flynn was arrogant, overconfident. That meant he wasn't worried about Ryan escaping, probably didn't even think it was possible. That was a mistake. Flynn took another drag of his cigarette, watching Ryan like a predator playing with its food. "You should have taken the out when I offered it. Now, you're gonna die in this shithole, and no one's even gonna remember your name." Ryan tilted his head, blood dripping onto his shirt. "That's where you're wrong." Flynn's smirk faltered. For half a second, then the door creaked open again. Ethan stepped inside. He looked different from before. The arrogance was gone. No smirk, no lazy confidence. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were stormy. Flynn straightened. "Took you long enough?" Ethan didn't answer. His gaze was locked onto Ryan, studying him like he was looking for something he wasn't sure he wanted to find. Flynn exhaled, rolling his shoulders. "All right, man. He's all yours." He gestured toward the door. "Just don't take too long. I want to get this over with." Ethan didn't move, didn't speak. Then finally he walked forward, his boots echoing against the concrete. He stopped a foot away from Ryan, staring down at him. Ryan met his gaze. No words were exchanged, but they didn't need to be. The weight of their history filled the silence. Ethan pulled a knife from his belt. Flynn grinned, stepping back to watch. Ryan didn't flinch. Ethan moved fast. The knife slashed downward and cut the zip ties. Flynn's grin vanished. "What the fuck?" Ryan moved. He surged up from the chair, ignoring the screaming pain in his ribs. His elbow smashed into Flynn's face, sending him stumbling backward. Ryan grabbed the chair and swung it, metal cracking against Flynn's skull. He went down hard, The other two guards outside heard the commotion and burst in. Ryan barely had time to react before the first one swung a baton. He ducked, driving a fist into the man's gut before grabbing his arm and twisting hard. A snap, a scream. The baton clattered to the ground. The second guard rushed forward, knife in hand. Ethan moved first. His own blade flashed, slicing across the man's wrist. The knife dropped. Ethan grabbed him by the collar and drove his knee into the guy's stomach, sending him crashing to the floor. Ryan turned back to Flynn, who was groaning, blood dripping from a gash above his eye. Ryan grabbed him by the vest, pulling him up, just enough to make sure he was looking right at him. "Tell Blackwood I'm coming." Then he slammed Flynn's head into the concrete. The room went silent. Ryan exhaled, wincing as the pain in his ribs flared. He turned to Ethan. "We need to move." Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "Follow me." They slipped out of the room, stepping over the bodies, into the cold Detroit night. The war wasn't over. It was just getting started. Ryan moved through the darkness like a ghost, each breath sharp against the cold Detroit air. His ribs ached with every step, but pain was secondary. He had no time for it now. Ethan led the way, moving fast, his shoulders tense, his head on. A swivel, the weight of what he had done, turning against the iron fangs, was heavy in the air between them. They both knew there was no going back. The gang would hunt him just as fiercely as they would hunt Ryan, and if they got caught before they found a way to strike first, they were as good as dead. They cut through back alleys and abandoned lots, weaving through the forgotten parts of the city, where streetlights flickered like dying fireflies and the air reeked of oil and decay. Ryan kept his senses sharp, scanning for shadows that moved the wrong way, for the sound of an engine idling too long. Every instinct screamed that they were being watched, hunted. But that wasn't new. He had lived in that state for years. Back, when the enemies had worn different colors, carried different weapons. The war might have changed, but the battlefield felt the same. After 10 minutes, Ethan ducked into a side door of an old warehouse, pulling Ryan in behind him. The place was empty, save for rusted machinery and a lingering scent of gasoline. A single bulb flickered overhead, casting their shadows against the concrete walls. Ethan exhaled, dragging a hand through his hair. "We need to talk," Ethan said, his voice tight. Ryan leaned against a metal beam, testing his ribs. "No shit!" Ethan paced, jaw clenched, his body radiating frustration. "You don't get it, Ryan. I just burned every bridge I had left. The Iron Fangs aren't going to forgive this. Blackwood isn't going to forgive this. You made me choose, and now we're both screwed." Ryan studied him, his face unreadable. "No one made you do anything. You could have killed me back there." Ethan stopped pacing. "Yeah, well, maybe I should have." The words were bitter, but there was no real weight behind them. He sighed, rubbing his hands over his face. "You don't get it, man. I had a place, a system. I knew the rules. Now I'm a dead man walking." Ryan pushed off the beam, his movements slow, controlled. "So what are you gonna do about it?" Ethan let out a short, humorless laugh. "You got a plan, Walker? Because unless you've got an army hidden somewhere, we're 2 guys against 100. And that's before Blackwood even gets involved." Ryan reached into his jacket, pulling out a small, battered flash drive. He held it up between 2 fingers. "We don't need an army, we just need this." Ethan frowned. "What the hell is that?" "Proof." Ryan pocketed the drive again. "Blackwood isn't just running a gang, he's running a business. The Iron Fangs are just his muscle. But this," he tapped his jacket, "this is his real crime. Financial records, wire transfers, bribes, enough to bury him if it gets into the right hands." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "Where the hell did you get that?" "Sarah." Ryan met his gaze. "She's been sitting on it for months. One of Blackwood's people tried to cover their tracks, but he got scared and left a copy with her. He thought she could keep it safe." His voice darkened. "Then he disappeared." Ethan exhaled. "Shit. Yeah. Ryan's voice was firm. "This is how we end him." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ground. When he finally looked up, his expression was unreadable. "You really think it's that easy? You hand this off, and suddenly Blackwood's in cuffs?" Ryan shook his head. "No, but it's a start. We get this to someone who isn't in his pocket, and we make sure the city knows what he's doing. Once the right people start asking questions, he'll have bigger problems than us." Ethan scoffed. "And you think the Fangs are just gonna let that happen? You think they won't burn the whole damn city down trying to cover this up?" Ryan's stare was cold. "Then we hit first." Ethan let the words settle. He wasn't stupid. He knew what Ryan meant. This wasn't just about exposing Blackwood. It was about making sure the Iron Fangs weren't strong enough to fight back when it happened. He exhaled sharply. "You got a target in mind?" Ryan nodded. "Their main supply hub, weapons, drugs, cash, it all moves through there before it spreads out. We take it down. We cripple them." Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. "That place is locked down. All tight, guarded 24/7. Ryan's expression didn't change. "Then we'll have to be creative." Ethan let out a slow breath. "Jesus, man, you really don't stop, do you?" Ryan smirked, but there was no humor in it. "Not when the job's not done." Ethan shook his head, but there was something new in his eyes, a flicker of the old loyalty buried under years of resentment. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling hard. "All right, Walker, you want a war?" His lips curled slightly. "Then let's give 'em one." The warehouse loomed ahead, an old shipping depot converted into the Iron Fang's primary supply hub. Rusted freight containers lined the lot, stacked haphazardly, their metal surfaces covered in gang tags and bullet scars. Dim floodlights flickered, above, casting long, shifting shadows across the gravel lot. At least a dozen bikes were parked near the entrance, their chrome gleaming under the weak glow. 2 armed guards stood by the loading dock, smoking, laughing, completely unaware that their night was about to turn into hell. Ryan crouched behind an abandoned car, eyes locked on the building's entrance. His ribs ached with every breath, but the pain was just background noise now, something to be ignored. Ethan knelt beside him, tension coiled in his muscles, his fingers wrapped tight around the grip of a stolen pistol. There was no turning back. This was the point of no return. "You sure about this?" Ethan murmured, barely above a whisper. Ryan didn't look at him. "You having second thoughts?" Ethan exhaled sharply. "Not about burning this place down, just wondering if we're both making sure we don't walk away from this." Ryan checked the magazine of his gun, then slid it back into place with a quiet click. "We hit them fast, hard, take out the guards, plant the charges, and get out before reinforcements show up." Ethan smirked. "Just like the old days." Ryan's eyes remained on the warehouse. "Almost." Ethan let out a slow breath, then nodded. "All right, let's do this." They moved like shadows, slipping between the rusted containers, keeping low. The 2 guards by the dock were too busy bullshitting to notice when Ryan closed the distance. He moved fast, stepping out of the darkness and smashing the butt of his pistol into the first man's skull. The second guard barely had time to react. Before Ethan grabbed him, twisted his arm behind his back, and drove a knife into his ribs. The man let out a wet gasp, then crumpled to the ground. Ryan caught the first guard before he hit the concrete and dragged him behind a stack of crates. He wiped the blood off his pistol and nodded toward the main entrance. "Move!" Inside, the warehouse was alive with activity. More guards, more bikes, stacks of crates filled with cash. Drugs and ammunition lined the walls. A small office overlooked the floor, its windows dimly lit, where someone, probably the lead distributor, was watching the operation. The whole place reeked of gasoline, metal, and sweat. Ryan pulled the homemade explosive from his backpack, a small but effective charge rigged to detonate once they were clear. He handed a second one to Ethan. "Plant it near the cache." Ethan arched an eyebrow. "And here I thought you didn't have a reckless side." Ryan smirked. "Things change." They split up. Ethan moved toward the far end, weaving between stacks of stolen merchandise. Ryan kept low, creeping past a trio of Iron Fangs who were loading crates onto a truck. He slipped behind a forklift and placed his charge beneath a stack of wooden pallets. The timer started counting down. 5 minutes. Ethan gave a small nod. From across the room, his charge was set. Then all hell broke loose. A voice shouted. One of the Fangs had spotted Ethan. Gunfire erupted. Ethan dove behind a crate as bullets splintered the wood. Ryan took down the first shooter with a clean headshot, his pistol kicking in his grip. He grabbed a rifle from one of the fallen men and fired into the chaos, taking down another. The warehouse exploded into action. More bikers poured in from the side doors, guns blazing. Ethan took down 2 before sprinting toward the exit. Ryan covered him, his shots precise, calculated. He grabbed a crowbar from the floor and hurled it at a charging thug, the metal slamming into the man's face with a sickening crunch. Then a shotgun blast tore through the air. Ryan felt the impact before he heard the sound. His shoulder ignited in white-hot agony as the force spun him sideways. He hit the ground hard, breath punched from his lungs. Ethan turned, eyes wide. "Walker!" Ryan gritted his teeth, rolling behind a stack of crates as more gunfire shredded the air around him. Blood soaked through his jacket, warm and fast. He pressed a hand against the wound, forcing himself to stay conscious. Not now. Not yet. Ethan gunned down the shooter and sprinted to Ryan's side. "We need to move, now!" Ryan's vision blurred, but he nodded. The bomb's timer had less than a minute left. They staggered toward the exit as the last remaining bikers fired wildly in their direction. Ryan barely felt the pain as adrenaline carried him forward. Then the explosion hit. The warehouse erupted in a fireball, heat and pressure slamming into them like a truck. The force sent them both sprawling across the gravel. Smoke and debris rained down as the night lit up in orange and red. The screams of the dying echoed through the flames. Ryan coughed, rolling onto his back. Ethan was beside him, breathing. Hard, they had done it. The Iron Fang's main supply hub was gone, but as sirens wailed in the distance, Ryan knew this was far from over. This was just the beginning. Ryan's breath came in ragged gasps as he pressed his back against the cold brick wall of a ruined gas station, his shoulder screaming in agony. The gunshot wound was bad, but not fatal. At least not yet. Blood seeped through his jacket, soaking into the fabric, but his hands remained steady as he gritted his teeth against the pain. Across from him, Ethan crouched, reloading his pistol, eyes darting toward the distance where the faint wail of sirens cut through the night. They had escaped the burning wreckage of the warehouse, but barely. The city was waking up, and the Iron Fangs wouldn't be far behind. Ethan exhaled sharply, wiping soot and sweat from his face. That was one hell of a mess. Ryan forced a smirk, his breath shallow. Yeah, seemed like a good idea at the time. Ethan shook his head, running, a hand through his hair. "We just put a bullet in Blackwood's operation. He won't take this sitting down." His voice was low, edged with something Ryan couldn't quite place. Excitement, maybe, or fear, maybe both. "We need to disappear." Ryan shifted, wincing as fire licked up his arm. "Not yet." Ethan stared at him, incredulous. "Jesus. Christ, Walker, you're bleeding out. We barely made it out of there alive, and you want to keep pushing?" He gestured toward the city, where distant shadows moved between alleys and streetlights flickered over empty roads. "They're looking for us right now." Ryan's jaw tightened. He knew Ethan was right, but they weren't done. Not yet. The explosion had crippled Blackwood's network, but the man himself was still standing. And as long as he was standing, this war wasn't over. He pulled the blood-stained flash drive from his pocket and held it up. "This is the kill shot." His voice was hoarse but steady. "We get this into the right hands, and Blackwood burns." Ethan hesitated, staring at the small piece of plastic and metal like it was a live grenade. Who the hell do we give it to? The cops? Half of them are on his payroll. Ryan's eyes were hard. Not all of them. Silence hung between them. Ethan exhaled, running a hand down his face. You got a name? Ryan nodded. Detective. Cole. Ethan let out a low whistle. Cole's a damn ghost. No one even knows if he's still working cases. Ryan's lips curled slightly. Then it's time to find out. The sirens were getting closer. They had minutes, maybe less. Ethan cursed under his breath. All right, fine. But first we patch you up before you drop dead. Ryan didn't argue. He knew his limits, and he was already pushing them. They moved quickly, sticking to the shadows, avoiding main roads. Every dark alley felt like a potential ambush. The Iron Fangs weren't just pissed, they were hunting, and with their supply hub gone, they were desperate. Desperate men were dangerous men. After 15 minutes, they reached a rundown clinic on the edge of town. No signs, no open doors, just a single flickering light above a reinforced side entrance. Ethan knocked 3 times, paused, then knocked. Twice more. A few seconds passed before the door cracked open, revealing a sharp-eyed woman in scrubs, her dark hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. Sarah Mitchell. She took one look at Ryan's bloodied state and sighed. What the hell did you do this time? Ryan smirked weakly. Same thing I always do. Piss off the wrong people. Sarah stepped aside, motioning them in. Get him on the table, and don't bleed all over my floor. Ethan helped Ryan inside, guiding him toward an old medical table in the back room. The clinic smelled of antiseptic and old coffee, a place built on necessity rather than comfort. Sarah grabbed a pair of gloves, snapping them on as she grabbed gauze and a needle. Shirt off, she ordered. Ryan groaned as Ethan helped peel the ruined jacket and shirt away, exposing the wound, an ugly, ragged hole torn through muscle. Just below his collarbone, the bleeding had slowed, but the pain was relentless. Sarah clicked her tongue. Through and through, you got lucky. Ryan chuckled, but it came out more like a wheeze. Yeah, feels like it. Sarah didn't waste time. She cleaned the wound with brutal efficiency, ignoring his hiss of pain as she worked. You're an idiot, she muttered. You should be in a hospital. Ryan clenched his jaw. Not an option. Sarah shot him a glare but didn't argue. She stitched him up in silence, her hands quick and precise. Ethan paced nearby, checking the window every few seconds. When Sarah finally finished, she cut the thread and stepped back. You need rest. And you need to stop getting shot. Ryan pulled his shirt back on with a grimace. I'll work on that. Sarah folded her arms. What now? Ryan held up the flash drive. Now? We end this. Ethan sighed, rubbing his temple. Jesus, Walker, you really don't quit. Ryan's eyes were cold, unwavering. Not until Blackwood falls. Sarah glanced between them, her expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, she exhaled and walked to a cabinet. She pulled out a key and tossed it to Ryan. There's an old car out back, no plates, no registration. Take it and go. Ryan caught the key, nodding. Appreciate it. Sarah shook her head. Just don't get yourselves killed. Ethan smirked, already heading for the door. No promises. As they stepped outside, the cold night air hit them like a slap. Ryan exhaled, gripping the key tight in his fist. They had what they needed. The final play was in motion, but as he glanced toward the distant skyline, he couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The stolen car rattled as Ryan gripped the wheel, his knuckles white, pain pulsing through his shoulder with every bump in the road. The city stretched ahead, cold and lifeless, streetlights flickering against the wet pavement. Beside him, Ethan loaded a fresh magazine into his pistol, his face grim, jaw tight. The flash drive sat between them on the dashboard, small and unassuming, but heavy with the weight of everything it contained. Blackwood's empire exposed, their one shot at taking him down. Ethan exhaled, eyes locked on the windshield. You really think Cole's gonna help us? Ryan didn't answer immediately. He had never met Detective Cole in person, but he had heard the stories. The last clean cop in a city drowning in corruption, a man who had spent years going after Blackwood's operation, only to find doors slammed in his face at every turn. If anyone would take this evidence and run with it, it was him. But that didn't mean it would be easy. Ryan finally spoke, voice rough. He doesn't have a choice. Ethan let out a humorless chuckle. Everybody has a choice, Walker. Ryan didn't argue. Instead, he turned onto a side street, pulling the car into an alley behind a rundown bar. The kind of place where no one asked questions, the kind of place a cop like Cole would meet if he didn't want to be seen. The two of them stepped out into the cold air, keeping to the shadows. Ryan's body protested with every movement, but he pushed through it. They were too close now. The back door of the bar creaked open before they even knocked. A man stood in the doorway, late 40s, weary eyes, a pistol resting loosely in his hand. Detective Cole. He glanced between them, then stepped aside. Inside, now. Ryan and Ethan moved quickly, shutting the door behind them. The room was small, dimly lit, a storage area with crates stacked against the walls. Cole leaned against a table, studying them with the sharp, skeptical look of a man who had been burned too many times before. "You better have a damn good reason for dragging me into this," Cole muttered. Ryan pulled the flash drive from his pocket and tossed it onto the table. "Everything you need to put Blackwood away." Cole didn't move immediately. His gaze lingered on the drive, suspicion flickering in his eyes. "And why the hell should I trust you?" Ethan scoffed. "Because we just blew up his goddamn warehouse." Cole's eyebrow twitched. "Yeah, I heard about that," he exhaled, rubbing his temple. "Jesus Christ. You know what you've done? The whole city's on edge. Blackwood's people are looking for blood." Ryan stepped closer, his voice low, controlled. "Then let's give them something else to worry about." Cole hesitated. Then slowly, he picked up the drive and walked over to an old laptop on the desk. He plugged it in, his fingers moving over the keys, his eyes scanning the files. Ryan watched as Cole's expression shifted, from skepticism to shock, then to something colder. "This," Cole whispered, "this is everything." Ryan nodded. "Names, dates, transactions, it's enough to bury him." Cole's jaw tightened. "Assuming I live long enough to use it." Ethan leaned against the wall. "That's your problem, Detective. Ours is getting out of here before Blackwood finds us." As if on cue, the distant roar of motorcycles filled the air. The sound sent a chill through the room. Ryan's body went rigid. "They found us." Cole cursed under his breath, grabbing his gun. "Back door leads to an alley. We need to move." Ethan cracked his neck. Too late. The first bullet shattered the front window, spraying glass across the room. Ryan dove for cover as the second shot tore through a crate behind him. Ethan was already moving, returning fire through the broken window. Cole ducked behind the desk, gripping the flash drive like it was his lifeline. "We are so screwed." Ryan ignored the pain in his shoulder as he popped up, firing 2 quick shots. One of the iron fangs went down, but more were coming. Ethan shouted, "We need to get to the car." Ryan grabbed Cole by the arm and pulled him toward the back door. More bullets ripped through the walls as they stumbled into the alley. The stolen car was still running, but 3 bikers were blocking the exit, guns raised. Ryan didn't hesitate. He raised his pistol and fired. The first man went down instantly, his weapon clattering to the pavement. Ethan took out the second before he could react. The third hesitated just long enough for Cole to put a bullet in his knee. The man collapsed with a scream. Ethan shoved Cole toward the passenger seat. "Drive!" Ryan slid behind the wheel, the pain in his body drowned out by adrenaline. He slammed the gas pedal, tires screeching as they tore out of the alley. More bikes roared behind them, headlights slicing through the night. Cole twisted in his seat, gripping the dashboard. "Where the hell are we going?" Ryan didn't take his eyes off the road. "Somewhere they can't follow." Ethan smirked, loading a fresh magazine. "Yeah? You got a magic trick for that?" Ryan's grip tightened on the wheel. Yeah, the river. Cole's eyes widened. Are you insane? Ryan didn't answer. He just pressed harder on the gas. The iron fangs weren't letting up. Bullets cracked against the trunk as they closed in. The city lights blurred past, the roads narrowing as they weaved through side streets. Then, finally, the bridge came into view. The river stretched below, dark and endless. Ryan exhaled. Hold on. The car hit the guardrail at full speed. The world flipped. Cold water swallowed them whole. Darkness. Silence. Ryan fought against the shock of the impact, his body screaming as icy currents yanked him downward. The car twisted, sinking fast. Ethan was already moving, kicking the door open, dragging Cole with him. Ryan pushed through the broken window, lungs burning, every movement an agonizing effort. They surfaced together, gasping. The iron fangs were shouting from the bridge, but they weren't stupid enough to follow. Ethan treaded water, laughing breathlessly. Jesus Christ, Walker! Ryan coughed, his body numb. Told you, magic trick. Cole was still gripping the flash drive. His expression was unreadable, but there was something new in his eyes. Respect, maybe. Ryan turned toward the shore, the city looming in the distance. They weren't safe yet, but Blackwood's days were numbered. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. Your support helps us grow and bring you even more amazing content. See you in the next one.